Well, good morning. I'm Aaron Hall, an attorney for business owners and entrepreneurial companies. But today I'm here as an educator. This live Q&A is an educational video session where people can ask questions for educational purposes. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you're being represented by an attorney, the attorney is going to have a very different relationship with you. First, the communications between you and the attorney are privileged. They're protected by attorney-client privilege. In this case, anything you post online is on the internet for everybody to see forever. Second, an attorney can take the time to understand your concerns, your goals, your questions, and your circumstances. Whereas that is not possible on a YouTube channel like this. On this YouTube channel, I'm going to use your questions as a prompt to think through and educate listeners and viewers who want to know more about how do you avoid common problems in a business? How do you avoid the legal trouble? How do you stick with best practices? How do you identify issues to discuss with your attorney and legal work to do to avoid expensive legal problems in the future? So I am not your attorney today. I'm here as an educator. And if you get some ideas from this session today, I encourage you to use that as an opportunity to discuss those ideas with your attorney. Please don't rely on them without consulting with an attorney. All right, let me take a look at some other announcements here for today. By the way, if you don't already have the free handout and access to the exclusive videos that I send to subscribers, there's no charge. You can get them at aaronhall.com/free. I highly recommend every business owner, entrepreneur, CEO, or person who wants to be one of those categories someday to sign up to get those free resources. I provide a lot of content here on YouTube, but there's some really high quality content that's only available to subscribers. And the best way to get that is go to aaronhall.com/free. You can sign up to get that, no charge whatsoever. You can also find us on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, and various other social media platforms. All right, if you have questions today, feel free to put them in the question or discussion box below. I'd be happy to answer your questions before any other questions that were identified ahead of time, because as a reward for you showing up first, I want to make sure that your questions are answered first. All right, let's take a quick peek and see if there are any questions yet. Welcome, Christopher Levinson. Great to have you here this morning. All right. Just taking a look here. Any other announcements? Looks like we're ready to go. So let's jump into the first question. Should an attorney represent the business or business owner? That is an interesting question. Just make a quick note here. Should the attorney represent the business or business owner? So here's the context. You are a business owner and you would like to hire a business attorney to help you, but really to help your business. And the attorney says, I need to identify who is the client. Is the client you as an owner, or is it a business? And you might say, why does it matter? It matters not right now, but down the road for some really important reasons. Let's talk about those. Let's say, for example, that you no longer own the business down the road. Let's say you sell it, or you no longer own all of it. You bring in another investor or another owner. Or let's say, for whatever reason, an ex-spouse gets half or a creditor gets some sort of rights. If the attorney's fiduciary duties are to the business, in other words, if the attorney represents the business, then the attorney-client privilege is to the business. And business owners generally have access to the communications between the attorney and the business. So that's one important reason, attorney-client privilege. Here's another important reason. An attorney has a duty of loyalty to a client. And that duty of loyalty, or there are elements of that duty that exist even after the representation has ended. So let's say, for example, that an attorney has a fiduciary duty to a business. And then let's say that down the road, you have a second owner come into the business. You sell half the shares, you bring in an investor because you want to bring money, whatever the reason may be. Now, all of a sudden, your individual interests are not exactly aligned necessarily with the interests of the business. Now, they may be for a while, but let's say, for example, you start taking money out of your company improperly. When you own the business yourself, that didn't really matter. You had to make sure the IRS got their fair share of taxes, but aside from that, if you're stealing from your own company, you own the company, it doesn't matter. But if there's another business owner there, now the question is the attorney's duty of confidentiality, duty of loyalty, and other ethical duties under state law to you as the business owner or to the company as an entity? This is such an important issue when there are multiple owners or multiple investors, or whether there are messy issues affecting the company that and the business owner has different risks or different interests. So let me tell you how I handle this. I usually prefer to represent the business owner, and the business owner can have me serve the company, but my fiduciary duties are to the business owner. Now, I would have, if I were representing the company in a lawsuit and then later another owner came in, I would have to take a careful look at state ethics rules regarding whether I maybe need to withdraw. One of the issues is if an attorney represents both an owner and another party, like a business, and there's a conflict of interest between the two, as a general rule, the attorney needs to withdraw from the case. So, although it might seem really trivial and frivolous to worry about does the attorney represent the business owner or the business, my general approach is, as an attorney, to represent the owner. So I have very clear duties. I'm looking out for the individual, the human, even if those interests at some point conflict with the business. All right, let's take a look at the next question we have here. Why should business sellers avoid seller financing? Imagine you are selling a business. There is one really important thing you're worried about, and that is getting paid. And there can be risks when you are doing seller financing, risks that result in you not getting paid. What is seller financing? It's when you agree that you will accept payments over time from the buyer of your business. So, for example, you're selling a business and Mary comes along, and Mary is going to buy your business. But Mary, and let's say you're selling your business for $1 million. So you say, all right, Mary, if you can come up with $100,000, I will finance the remaining $900,000. So essentially, it's going to be a loan, kind of like a mortgage, but a loan to Mary. And Mary's going to repay that. So let's say in this hypothetical that Mary gets all the shares right away. So she's 100% owner when she pays that $100,000. And then there's a promissory note. And that promissory note says, Mary, you need to pay the remaining 900,000 over, let's say, 5 years. And let's say it's at a 5% interest rate or whatever the parties agree to. What happens if Mary stops making those payments? Or what happens if she has buyer's remorse and decides, you know what, the business isn't as good as I thought it was? Or what happens if Mary runs that business to the ground and now the business is worthless and Mary doesn't have the money to keep making the payments? Unfortunately, that's a scenario that I've seen played out time and time again. In this scenario, often what happens is the buyer, we'll call her Mary, buys the business. But then she makes a number of changes, believing those changes will help the business. But for whatever reason, the business does not do as well under Mary as it did under the seller. Maybe it's because the changes Mary made were not helpful. Maybe they actually hurt. Maybe Mary decided to upgrade the technology within the company or make procedural changes or make human resource changes. So she fired some employees and brought in some new folks. All of these things are very common, but often they can result in a change in the profitability of the company. Mary believes they'll improve the profitability. And if that's the case, we have no problems. But if the changes result in negative consequences to the company, Mary may not be able to continue making payments. But it might not just be that. Maybe the reason the problems start in the company after Mary takes over is Mary doesn't have the same personality, or Mary doesn't have the same relationships, or maybe there's something like COVID or some big circumstance totally outside of Mary's control. Whatever the reason is, it is often the case that when a person buys a business, the business doesn't do as well as it did when it was run by the seller. So, are you as a seller willing to accept the risk that the buyer may not be able to pay you the amount that you've agreed to? That is often the risk with seller financing, because if there are problems and the buyer can't pay, and let's assume the company gets altered in a way that makes it less profitable, you now find yourself with a person who cannot afford to pay. They can file bankruptcy. And you find yourself with a business that's in shambles because it's gone through all the transition of going from under your management to a new buyer's management, and whatever changes have been implemented since that time. That might be firing of key employees, changing of technology, whatever. So those are the reasons why seller financing can be very risky and why sellers should consider whether they want to accept that risk. But there are some ways to mitigate that risk. In other words, you can do seller financing in ways that avoid some of those problems. One way is to hold on to some control, some sort of management, or have management shift or gradually transition over time. That can actually work well, but it can be frustrating for the buyer because the buyer often wants to implement changes. And so often it makes sense for the potential buyer and seller to have a conversation about what does this transition period look like. The other reason that may not work well is the seller might say, I want to be done with this thing. I want to retire. I want to move to another state, whatever the plans may be after running the business. Often a seller is selling because they're tired of running the business. And so they may not want to remain in management. They might say, hey, I'm willing to accept the risk of losing control over management. There's another thing that sellers can do to protect themselves in seller financing scenarios. Rather than immediately transferring all ownership to the buyer, the seller can say, I will transfer the shares upon final payment of the purchase price. So for example, If the seller receives $100,000 as an upfront payment and then 5 years of payments, which include interest, for the remaining $900,000 in the $1 million purchase price, then it will not, the shares and the full ownership will not transfer to the buyer until after 5 years. Now, buyers may not be happy about that because ultimately it gives the owner, the seller, full control over the business and controlling that. But that is one protection that can be put in place. Sometimes there's some sort of hybrid where a percentage of shares will transfer each year as the buyer timely makes payments. Another alternative, this isn't called seller financing, but if the business is doing well and it has financial reports and history showing a profit, those reports can be presented to a bank. And then the bank can look at the creditworthiness of the business to determine whether to fund a large portion, let's say 90%, of the buyout. And this is often done through an SBA loan. So you get the SBA loan through your local bank, but the SBA backs that loan or guarantees that loan so that even if the buyer defaults on it, the bank isn't out 100% of the money. The bank is only out a portion of the money. And typically the SBA will guarantee more than half of the loan. So that allows banks to offer larger loans than they would otherwise do at lower interest rates than they would otherwise do. So an SBA loan is a great option for buyers because they have a lower interest rate and they get all the shares right up front. An SBA loan is also a great option for sellers because they get their cash up front. As I started out answering this question, one of the biggest concerns for a business seller is, am I going to get paid? And so making sure that the seller gets paid is one of my top goals when representing a business seller. So to recap here, let's see. Let me just take a quick peek at this. Why should business sellers avoid seller financing? Because there's a substantial risk they won't get paid. But in this video, I've talked about a number of ways that you can mitigate those risks. And if you are interested in additional information, you can take a look in the description below. We will post a link afterwards where you can get additional information about factors to consider when deciding what is the best way for your business sale to be financed. All right, let's take a look at the next question here. What are businesses that never fail or have amazingly low failure rates? Well, if you look at statistics, you will see that there's certain types of machines like coin-operated laundry centers, Coke and Pepsi and snack machines, I guess vending machine businesses, rental property, because typically, even if you're just breaking even on the rental payments, you are your property is appreciating in value on average over time. Other options that are less commonly known include having a salon where you rent out chairs to the stylists. So you are essentially providing an environment where people can rent from you. Another similar scenario is where you have a commercial building and tenants rent from you to run their business. Often those rental arrangements are for a long period of time. and that can be a low risk option. Sometimes co-working spaces can be low risk once they get started and have a vibrant established community, because essentially the owner of the co-working space is renting out desks, offices, or rooms to long-term business tenants. And so that can have a low likelihood of failure. Another option is utility companies. Not easy to get into, but it's fairly well established that a utility company has a monopoly or near monopoly for providing gas or electricity or cable and internet services. So that's another example. But those examples aren't really helpful if you don't want to go into one of those industries or niches. And so perhaps a more helpful response to finding a business that has a low failure rate is to look for a business in any industry that has a moat around it. And what I mean by moat is that there is something that protects that business from other competitors getting in. There's a book a few years back called Blue Ocean Strategy, and it basically talks about how um, when there is when you're out in a blue ocean where it's just blue water and nobody else is competing with you, you have an extraordinary advantage, and it would take a long time for somebody else to come in and try to compete with you. But if the ocean is red with blood, because there are so many ships fighting for the same fish or fighting for the same space, a very competitive environment, you are going to be very distracted by competitors and them dropping prices and trying new approaches, etc. So, what are some examples of this? Uh, you may not remember this, but when I was growing up, PCs, window based computers, were taking off. And Apple decided to take a very different approach. They decided to be the computers for the education space. And then Apple decided to be computers for people who are into audio and video. And then Apple came out with or integrated using a mouse and a graphic user interface. Now, of course, Windows eventually adopted that, but Apple was creating things that didn't have competitors, at least for quite some time. Another more current example is Tesla. When Tesla came out with electric vehicles, people said this is ridiculous. It's never been done. And there's a reason it's never been done, because it can't be done. You can't put enough batteries into a vehicle to actually have it be drivable for a long distance. Those sorts of batteries don't exist. Well, what did Tesla do? It designed those batteries and manufactured those batteries. And for a period of time, if you wanted an electric vehicle that was able to actually be used to drive long distances and actually worked well, you had to go with Tesla. There was nobody else out there. They had a blue ocean. No other ships were competing with them. No other businesses were competing. Another way to look at it is them being in this new space had a moat. So if you're thinking about investing in a company or growing your own company, often you want to think about what is that moat that you can have. Because if you go into a space and your only approach to competition is a better price, or we're going to get to the customers first, it's really tough. It's tough because quickly competitors can adapt to whatever you're doing. You have a lower price, they have a lower price, and that's just a race to the bottom. So thinking about how can your company have a blue ocean strategy? How can your offering be unique? And maybe it's finding a niche that is not being served well. and you dominate that niche. And you say, you know what, I'm not going to try to be all things to all people. I'm going to be the only one that is providing help in this niche. Generally, that is going to be a narrow market segment. For example, instead of saying, I'm going to be an accountant to all businesses or all small businesses, you say, I'm going to be an accountant to chiropractors. And then when you go out to chiropractors and meet with them, you can say, you know what, I'm not aware of any other accounting firm in this area that provides services just to chiropractors. Or perhaps it's just to SaaS companies, software as a service companies, or it's just to content creators and influencers, or just to sports players, professional athletes. By picking a market segment that you can serve that nobody else is specifically targeting, often you can establish yourself in that area and get a head start over anybody else, because a lot of times people in a company are trying to be all things to all people or sell to all segments. It's this fear that, hey, if I have my offering too narrow, I'm turning away other money. But as the saying goes, there are riches in niches. And so by focusing on a narrow niche, you often can create a moat around your company that's hard for anyone else to get into. That's an example of a moat from a branding or marketing perspective. Let's talk about other possibilities. Maybe you are the only one who has access to a certain material or a certain piece of equipment. I once talked with a company that produced, I believe it was the little rubber or metal piece that goes on leather footballs so that you can fill the air into a football. And they provided that to all of the footballs used for NFL and for college. What they did is, so they found that the market rate at the time for those little pieces was like $1.20 each. But they made a strategic decision to sell it for about 30 cents a piece. And they did that because they offered such a low price that nobody else would even think about getting into the space. And they had done that by refining their equipment, their manufacturing process, so they could produce this so much cheaper than anyone else that they found no competitors even thought about getting into their space. I'll give you one more example. There is a business who provides testing services to computer motherboards that go on satellites and other high-tech equipment that either handles extreme cold, extreme heat, or extreme vibration. And this company developed the equipment that provides testing for those motherboards. So if you are a manufacturer of these motherboards, you want to have the testing so you can get a rating done. This company created the unique equipment that does this. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to do this, and it would take a long time of research and development for anyone else to create this equipment. They kept it highly confidential what was in this equipment. And so they used trade secret rather than patent protection for this equipment, because patent protection means you have to register a patent, and now the public knows what they can just read the patent and see how you're using this equipment. So this equipment was used for testing, and nobody else could compete with them because anybody else would need to develop very expensive equipment and spend years in research and development. And nobody even had access to this testing equipment because it was a closely kept secret within this company. And so the services of testing motherboards that will handle extreme heat, cold, and vibration was only done by this single company. That is an example of a moat, a metaphorical moat, where nobody else can really get into this space. And this company could continue to increase its prices and continue to provide services because motherboard manufacturers had to use those services to ensure that their motherboards were ready for the extreme scenarios that would be presented by the manufacturer's customers, like satellite makers. All right, so when I look at going back to the original question, how do you find businesses that will never fail? There, of course, are niches out there and industries out there where you can find that. But I think of looking at a moat. The other thing that can help reduce any company's odds of going into failure is having an entrepreneurial operating system. For example, the entrepreneurial operating system discussed in Traction, Get a Grip on Your Business, which is a book by Gino Wickman. I highly recommend that book for companies with 10 to 100 employees. After 100 employees, the fundamentals of that book still work well, but you have additional layers of complexity. And so you will need to add other layers of management and system in place to ensure accountability and results. All right, let's take a look at the next question here. This question is by Bryce Gubler. I have an existing S Corp set up as a media production company. However, after 18 years, I'm moving into real estate investing and putting less time into producing media. And by the way, Bryce posted this on YouTube, so he made this question public. I'm simply reading it from there. So the plan is to create an LLC holding company and transfer all assets of the S Corp into it. However, since the real estate investing company hasn't yet generated income, I was thinking of simply creating a DBA and EIN within the S Corp. And then, once it starts generating revenue, change the name and articles to support it. Can that work? Well, an important caveat here is for something of this complex, I'd recommend hiring an attorney to help you because there are a lot of likely pitfalls when doing something like this. There are important tax considerations, there are important legal considerations. But let's see if I can summarize this question and then answer it from a general standpoint to help educate viewers who are watching. The question is essentially this. Should you use a current S Corp for a new business like real estate investing? I believe that that would be an accurate summary of this. In this scenario, there is a business owner running an S corporation and has been running that business for 18 years. The business owner is thinking about getting into real estate investing. And so he says, should I just set up a DBA for it for right now? And then start using that same company for real estate investing under the DBA. A DBA is just a nickname. It's not a new company. It's not a new entity. A DBA is just an alternative name for the existing entity. I don't recommend using a current company for buying large assets like real estate, because if there's any problem that comes back on that company later, all of the real estate assets are at risk because they're in the company. A better approach is to start a separate LLC for your real estate investing or buying other large assets. So if some problem like a lawsuit related to the old business is brought, that business's assets may be at risk, but the new LLC's assets, like the real estate, are not at risk in that lawsuit. So, as a general rule, you want to have assets that are expensive held in an LLC that does not have operations that could result in lawsuits or tax consequences. You might say, well, what kind of risks could a business owner or a business face after 18 years in business? Well, let's say, for example, 3 years earlier, an employee was let go, and that employee was having a bad attitude, and the business owner said, "I need to let you go." Let's say that that employee later sued for discrimination, wrongful termination, or improper payment of wages. I'm assuming that there's no statute of limitations that would prevent that, but that's a scenario where now you have a former employee, a disgruntled employee, suing the company. You don't want to have your real estate assets at risk to that lawsuit. Another example would be, let's say, for whatever reason, the company didn't report its taxes properly or didn't pay its taxes properly. That's another great example of where the company would have liability. But if you have your real estate assets in a separate LLC, you would not have liability there. So, as a general rule, if you have a business that has potential liabilities, so that's contracts, operations, employees, that should be separated from a separate entity where you have real estate investments or other significant assets. We call that a holding company. We call the ongoing business that is employees and contracts and operations an operating company. All right, let's cover the next question here. What are the essential steps to sell your business successfully? How do you ensure that if you are selling your business, it is successful? Let's talk about those steps. And before we get to those, let's talk about the big risks that we're concerned about. We're concerned about, if you're a seller, do you actually get full payment for your business? It's one thing to have a contract that says you're going to get paid a certain amount. It's another thing for that money to actually end up in your pocket. Business buyers will often promise payments, but we want to make sure that you actually get those. And so that's my number one concern as an attorney representing a seller of a business. The second concern is there a potential for a lawsuit from the seller later who has regrets about buying it? It is actually fairly common for a buyer of a business to have regrets and to say the business isn't as good as I was told it was. And that is so common that there are standard provisions that attorneys will put into documents for selling a business that say exactly what information a seller received about the business. And often there will be a list of all the risks that the business has and have been disclosed to the buyer. What you don't want is a buyer of a business to say, you sold me a business and you didn't tell me about this risk, and the financial information you gave me was inaccurate. It wasn't as profitable as you made it out to be, et cetera, et cetera. And then to have that buyer essentially as a claim for fraud or misrepresentation. And now you, as a business owner, are trying to defend a lawsuit. The reality is many times a business doesn't do as well under a buyer because the buyer doesn't have the same skills and experience that the business seller had. But buyers often do not acknowledge their own contribution to the failure of the business. Buyers think they're actually smarter than the seller. They're really good at business. It's not their fault things went bad. It's the seller's fault. So, having financial disclosures and risk disclosures are another important part of selling that. So, now that we have in mind the important concerns for the seller of a business, let's talk about the steps it takes to sell the business. Step one is typically having a confidentiality agreement or a non-disclosure agreement signed by the buyer before there's any sort, or potential buyer, before there's any exchange of information. Step two is exchanging some information with the buyer. Not all of it, but enough for the buyer to kind of kick the tires and figure out, is this a business I'm really interested in? And then you may have a discussion about what additional information does the buyer need. One thing the buyer might ask for is the buyer might say, I'd like to have a conversation with key employees of the business. Here's the issue there. First off, it makes perfect sense that a buyer would want to know, are the key employees going to stick around? But if the buyer has a conversation with those key employees and then doesn't buy the business, does that create some instability or insecurity among the employees? Does the fact that the business owner is considering selling the business affect the culture or morale or temperature of the company? And so often there will be discussions about what context will there be for the buyer to ask questions. For example, maybe the buyer will say, we'll have conversations with the business owner present, or maybe they'll be without the business owner present. And they'll talk about what's more appropriate there. The context for that conversation may not be, hey, I'm looking at buying a business and I want to know if you're going to stick around. Rather, it might be, we're having discussions about the growth of the company and the possibility of me becoming an investor. By the way, that's true. Buyers are investors in a company. And so the buyer would like to have conversations with the important employees. You've been identified as one of those important employees. Would you be open to having a conversation with this potential investor? That's typically only done shortly before actually closing a deal. And often it isn't done because often sellers are not comfortable with the buyer having those sorts of discussions. So you have this period where there's an exchange of information. Typically what's happening during that time as well is that there is an effort to line up financing, whether it be from a bank, through an SBA loan, or some other means. Often within this period, there is either a purchase agreement signed or a letter of intent. Let's talk about what those look like. A purchase agreement basically says, I will buy the business contingent on some additional steps of due diligence. And then there's going to be a closing date on a specific date. And by that date, all these steps will be done and the financing will be lined up and the deal will close. For example, that's typically how it's handled with a real estate transaction. A person signs a purchase agreement for the purchase of a home, but the closing date is scheduled further out because a lot of stuff has to be done in the meantime. There needs to be an inspection of the home, the mortgage needs to be lined up, etc. So that's one approach. Sometimes that's called a two-step transaction. Another approach is where you simply have the closing or the transaction, the actual purchase, occur on a certain day, and you have a letter of intent signed in advance. A letter of intent typically is non-binding, but it can have portions that are binding or can be an actual contract. I have a separate video on that. And so we will put in the description section below a link to the video I created on letters of intent, how they work, and what their limitations are. But if you have a letter of intent, typically it's a letter that says, the buyer says, here is my intention regarding buying the company. Here's what I've done so far. Here are the next steps. And essentially lays out in a non-binding manner. We have a general agreement on what those next steps are, but there isn't actually a commitment to buy the company until a formal purchase agreement is signed. You might say, how do you decide whether to have a purchase agreement with a closing date versus a letter of intent with a purchase agreement on the date the transaction occurs? Which approach is better and in which circumstances? Generally, it comes down to the size of the deal and the amount of attorney's fees the parties want to spend. In a large deal, it makes sense to do things really carefully, and that typically means then a purchase agreement initially and a closing date. And by the way, there might even be a letter of intent prior to that purchase agreement, and there might be a confidentiality agreement or non-disclosure agreement prior to that point. Whereas in a lower cost transaction, or let's say you're selling a business for $20,000, you don't want to spend $5,000 on legal fees. So you might say, you know what, let's just have either a letter of intent, or maybe not even a letter of intent. Let's just have some discussions about what the basic terms are. And then we'll have a lawyer draft up that purchase agreement for the actual date the transaction occurs. If it's a $20,000 transaction, a person may just have that money in their bank account. Whereas if it's a $5 million transaction, typically there's going to be some sort of outside financing, either with investors or a bank. And so more of the formalities are going to be followed in that business sale. So then you have the actual closing date, or the date when the transaction occurs. That may be the date when 100% of the shares transfer to the buyer. And shares is a term for corporations. In the LLC context, we call them membership interests. In a partnership, you call it partnership interests. But at the end of the day, it's the ownership. The ownership may immediately transfer on that date, but not necessarily. Many deals say ownership will transfer over time as payments are made. Or the deal might say, upon the final payment being made, 100% of the ownership is transferred. Another thing that usually happens as part of this transition is there's a discussion about to what extent will the seller's labor, time, and consulting be needed during a transition period to the new owner. So when a buyer takes over a business, it would be quite abrupt to have the seller stop working 100% and the buyer start taking over all duties 100%. Typically, the buyer has questions and needs some help from the seller. So there's usually discussion about to what extent will the seller provide some time, work, labor, or consulting services. For example, it might be the seller is willing to be available as much as is needed during the first week, and then up to 40 total hours for the next 6 months. And for that labor, the seller will be compensated as an employee of the company at a rate of whatever it is per hour, $50 per hour or whatever that looks like. Sometimes the sellers say, hey, I'll work for free for the first week. Or for some period of time. But often it's reasonable to have some sort of hourly wage tied to that so that the buyer is not, so that the buyer values the time of the seller and doesn't just waste that time because it's essentially free. Having some hourly wage or some compensation level for what the seller is doing often makes sense, especially in a large deal, so that the seller knows they're at least being compensated something for that time. and the buyer has an interest in keeping that time to only what's necessary or really useful for the company as it moves past the sale. So after that sale date, there's probably an exchange of money. There is a signing of any final documents. And then the buyer typically remains available and does some services for the seller does some services for the buyer for a little bit of time to ensure a smooth transaction. That is typically how it works. When the company does well and grows, typically I don't hear about it. People are happy, and sometimes I've even represented buyers down the road, and there's certain ethics rules regarding that. But if the company runs into problems, that's often where attorneys get back involved and start figuring out who's liable for these problems or how are we going to work this out. There are a lot of other details I didn't cover here, like what happens if you have inventory that's fluctuating. Well, in that case, you might have to have a payment for that inventory after the sale of the business because you may not even know how much inventory is in there on that exact date. There might also be issues around how much cash is in the accounts, what is the status of accounts receivable and accounts payable, and who is getting that money or owing that money. So a lot of pieces to be worked out, but at an overhead view, that is the process for ensuring the successful sale of the company. And if all goes well, the business seller will receive full payment for the purchase price, and the business seller will also not get sued for failing to disclose a risk or any sort of information as part of that transaction. You might be asking, in light of the fact that a seller is not aware of all the financial details and couldn't possibly disclose everything, what is the seller supposed to do? Because let's face it, there are mistakes in every company's financials. What prevents a buyer from coming back later and saying, you fraudulently included certain financial information and I wouldn't have bought it other than, or if I had known about that? Well, typically what you do is say, the buyer has had access to all of the financial information in the business. And you actually give the buyer access to all the paper documents and all the computer records and basically say, hey, buyer, you're welcome to come into the business for hours on end and review to your heart's content all this data. It's a massive amount of data. We're not going to give you a copy of it, but you have a right to come in and review everything to make sure that it's done to your satisfaction. You are also welcome to bring a CPA with you, paid for by you, buyer, so that the buyer has a full opportunity to review all of the financial information and details within the company. All right, let's take a look at the next question here. How do you know the best time to sell your business? A lot of times people think about selling their business when they're burnt out, when they're tired, when they're ready to retire. And then they start saying, what do I need to do to get the business ready? Ideally, you get the business ready years in advance. And here's what I mean. A lot of times business owners will use their company to cover expenses that they wouldn't usually cover, except for the fact that they own the business. I'll give you an example. A business owner may decide to have a company meeting in Hawaii. And for 3 of the 5 days in Hawaii, the business owner is having meetings there with the business owner's senior management, or maybe the business owner's spouse who also works in the company. Let's call it a strategic annual planning meeting in Hawaii. And the business owner, let's assume, is able to deduct all of that trip as a business expense. The airfare there, the hotel, etc. Maybe the business owner gets a little training while there. There are a lot of different ways that business owner can have a legitimate business tax deduction for something that provides a fairly fun and enjoyable vacation for the business owner. That's the kind of thing that may be in the financials of the company, reducing the profitability of the company. Usually, when you sell a company, the purchase price is based on the profits of the company times a period of time. So, for example, the purchase price might be last year's profits times 3 for 3 years. So the buyer might say, hey, I'll buy your business for last year's profits times 3 years. Or maybe it's last year's profits times 2 years or 8 years. It's all up for negotiation. But as you can see, a $20,000 trip to Hawaii will reduce your profits in a year by $20,000. But that will be multiplied times, say, 3 years in a purchase price. So it's actually reducing your purchase price by $60,000. That is a very simple example of why you want to have your company as profitable as possible for 2 to 3 years leading up to selling, because it is those years the buyer will look at when determining what price the buyer is willing to pay. The more profitable the company, as a general rule, the more a buyer is willing to pay. So either you stop going on those Hawaiian vacations for 3 years prior, or you clean up the financials to back those amounts out and then have that documented so the buyer can see why you are backing out some of those lawful tax exemptions that the business won't actually have after the buyer takes over the company. Other examples might be a company vehicle, wages at some level, or a family member's wages. It might be the purchase of technology that also has a significant benefit to the owner. There are a lot of lawful tax exempt expenses that a company won't continue to have after a new buyer takes over. And so generally, it's best to start dealing with that. Second, you want that's the financial piece, the purchase price piece. The next consideration in getting the maximum dollar amount is making sure your business can run without you, because the buyer probably isn't going to want you to continue to work there, and you probably don't want to stay in the business after you sell it. So having a good operating system in place is a valuable or strengthens the value of the company and increases the purchase price of the company, the amount you'll get paid. One example of that is Traction, Get a Grip on Your Business, which is a book by Gino Wickman talking about the entrepreneurial operating system. I love this operating system. I'm a huge fan. I have no ties to it, but I have seen time and time again where companies who have gone from 10 to 100 employees have grown and become more healthy through the EOS, or the entrepreneurial operating system, explained very simply in the book Traction, Get a Grip on Your Business by Gino Wickman. You can pick it up for a few dollars on Amazon. In fact, we'll put a link in the description below. All right, so having a strong operating system is important in increasing the value of the sale of your business. A next important piece is if you have any important employees, you might consider, if they are essential to running the business, having some sort of employment agreement in place. Maybe that's a non-solicitation agreement. Maybe it's an agreement to work for a number of years in the company, so that when a new buyer comes in, they are buying the value of the team that can run the company, and they are not at risk of losing people who are vital to the profitability of the company. So the timing of selling a company will substantially affect the purchase price you receive when you sell the company. And the pieces to start working on are cleaning up the financials so you are as profitable as possible, establishing an accountability and operating system within your company so that the company can run without you, and then ensuring that the vital employees of your company are able to stay after your departure. And you might even just sit back and say, are there any other parts of the company that won't run well if I leave? And then attend to those areas, because the value of your company is directly tied to the profits the buyer will expect after your departure. If your departure is likely to reduce the profits of the company, the buyer will pay less than she otherwise would have for your company. All right, we have covered a number of great topics today. I don't see any other questions that need to be answered right now. If you have other questions about things we've discussed or other legal topics or business topics, topics of importance to entrepreneurs, CEOs, and leaders running companies, please feel free to add them into the comments section below. I will use those questions to generate ideas and topics for future live Q&A sessions that you can watch right here. If you want to be alerted to the next live Q&A, you can subscribe on the YouTube channel and click notifications. You can subscribe to our newsletter to get an email update at aaronhall.com/free. Or if you join one of our other, or you follow us on one of the other social media platforms, you may, if the platform allows it, get some sort of update regarding our next live Q&A. Thanks for joining me here today. I'm Aaron Hall, an attorney for business owners and entrepreneurs. This is an educational program so that you can spot issues to discuss with your attorney, avoid common problems in companies, and hopefully enjoy the rewards of a more successful company and life. Thanks for joining today.